Hi, Misha here, and it's time for another review, look, talk, history on a model from the Eaglemoss official collection of diecast models from the BSG Battlestar Galactica universe. The original series, the reimagined, and now Blood and Chrome. And quite some time ago, talked about issue 10, the Colonial Raptor. This is Boomer's Raptor. And now issue 20 is pretty much the same ship, but in a different configuration for a different role. This is what Eaglemoss calls the Heavy Raptor. In reality, I think I've seen it called more the Assault Raptor, more than anything else. And this really shows you the two basic duties of a Raptor. It's a multi-role vessel that can be configured for several things, and has a couple of real-world inspirations. The Boomer version, which is more of the transport, reconnaissance, surveillance, is more like the EA-6B Prowler, whereas the Heavy Raptor, the Assault Raptor, is more of its other inspiration, and you can really tell it by the pods it has, the AH-64, better known as the Apache helicopter. So yeah, we'll talk about the different roles, mainly focusing on the new Heavy Raptor, and also compare it with some other ships in the Colonial Fleet, and maybe even a couple of the Cylon ships. So with that, let's just get into it and put it on the spinny thingy. Alrighty. So yeah, the name Heavy Raptor, while it, I guess, makes sense, when they first announced this over at Eaglemoss, I didn't know what the hell they meant, because they seem to be the only ones using this name for this version. Most places, if they were to give it a different name than the standard Raptor, would just call it an Assault Raptor, which makes sense, because this thing is loaded for bear. Every single hard point is loaded up. And that's really the difference, although it does have a different paint scheme, at least so people tell me. Looking at our standard Raptor here, this one, while I liked it when it came out, Boomer's Raptor, it is pretty bare bones. There's really nothing on the wings, and it's relatively light because it does have a good bit of polymer. This would be the ship in its more reconnaissance, transport, ECM role. Because yeah, this really was a multi-role craft. It was used during at least the latter half of the First Cylon War, and then it was used throughout the interwar period. And while it was definitely aging at the time of the fall of the colonies, it was still very much a frontline craft. There's not exactly something in the U.S. military like it. It is similar to a Huey, because it can be armed up or transport. I would say it really is like the AH-64 Apache or the A-10 Warthog, except neither of those have any carrying capacity for troops. They are assault craft. And this definitely can be used as an assault craft. Overall dimensions will be the same. It's just a hair over 28 feet long, and it has a wingspan of, about 18.5 feet, give or take what's on the hard points. And it's about 9 feet and some change tall. Has a standard crew of 2, pilot and Eco, who also doubles as the co-pilot, and they both sit in front in a side-by-side sitting arrangement on ejection seats. Although oftentimes the Eco will go back to work with the gear leaving the pilot up front. And there's a large cabin in the back. There seems like there's kind of a small workstation immediately behind here where they can work with the Dratus, which honestly, a lot of the space on the Raptor was dedicated to electronics equipment. And then behind that, in the main cabin, you have some options. You can carry, around 10 passengers, maybe 12 if they are very well acquainted with each other. Or 5 to 8 fully suited up, full-size Marines for a boarding party. Or, if you're in more of the assault role like this, you can give up cabin space to either carry more ammunition, fuel tanks, or just generally make room for the guns. This has multiple hardpoints. First off, we have an internal bay under the fuselage. And then we have these very interesting fuselage mounts on the sides here. And you can actually see them quite clearly looking at the Boomer Raptor because there's nothing on them. So there's just a empty slot where the hardpoint would be. And then we have more external hardpoints under the stub wings. There are 2 traditional under each wing, plus there's a wingtip mount, which is on modern fighters, is a little more restrictive in what you can carry. Now, I don't know total payload capability of the Raptor, but I can say, what it can carry, more or less. In the internal bay, you have some options. You can carry 2 nuclear-tipped ship-to-ship, or rather anti-ship missiles. Or you can carry 4 long-range missiles, or 8 short to medium-range missiles in the internal bays. Now, on these fuselage external hardpoints, you can carry these big blocks, which some sources say carry quote-unquote mini missiles. Others just basically call them rocket pods, but you get the idea. And these seem like they carry about a dozen units each, and they can only really be carried here. Under the wings, using the 2 wing hardpoints, we can carry rocket pods, or similar, here. And these carry a lot of small little rockets, up to 240, depending on the exact rocket and pod type. Often kind of fired in bursts. And of course you could carry 4 of those, and not just 1 on each wing. Next to it here we see the missiles. These come in clusters of 4, which are more of the short-range missiles. Alternatively, they could carry 2 medium-range missiles on each hardpoint, or 1 long-range missile on each hardpoint. Or they could carry fuel tanks externally. The Raptor is one of the few smaller colonial craft that have a jump drive. And standard, just going on internal fuel, it's good for about 10 jumps. But this can be increased to as many as 20 jumps with external tanks, each tank giving a little more than a jump each. Finally, the external rails, the wingtips, like you would see a AIM-9 Sidewinder in a real-world aircraft, they can carry short-range air-to-air defensive missiles, or in the case of this model, they can carry 2 30mm rapid-fire cannon. Typically, it's the Mech A15 cannon, which is kind of an external potted derivative of the Mech A6 found on the Viper. Long barrel for added range. And each of these cannon has a supply of about 800 rounds, 800 shells, and they can be high explosive, armor piercing, what have you. In addition, the nose carries, and this is usually a standard feature on all Raptors, two 20mm cannon with up to 3,000 rounds. So smaller rounds, more of them, but yeah. So all kitted up like this guy has at least 8 missiles visible, nearly 500 small rockets, 2 large cannon, 2 small cannon, and then it has these either small missiles or larger rockets, whatever you'd like to call them. So they are very well kitted up. Moving over to the back, these sticking out are chaff dispensers. And they're standard. Now, a Raptor can carry additional chaff pods, again under the wings for defense, or it can carry flare pods, or it can carry decoy drones, and it can carry electronic jamming pods. So it has some options. Back here, we have the Sublight Engines. Interestingly, the Blood and Chrome era, the First War era, early Raptors actually had gimbaling Sublight engines, but later ones seem to have fixed. But this spacecraft is a true VTOL capable, vertical takeoff and landing, whereas a Viper really isn't. So it doesn't need a runway to take off or land, and it can hover in atmosphere. Of course, it can hover in space too, but that space is a little different. Back here you can see the single outlet for the FTL drive as well, right there. That area. They have these 2 little stub wings that provide a moderate amount of lift, kind of like on a helicopter, and then we have these kind of side or rear tails that are considered rudder to help guide it in atmospheric flight, and of course the chaff pods. The standard hatch is on the port side here. This gives access to the cockpit and the rear cabin. It also, I'll move over here because it's a little easier with this one not being as kitted out. On the underside has a unique feature. There is a hatch on the bottom, along with a so-called docking skirt. This can be used for peaceful docking, of course, with other craft, or it can be used to dock with hostile craft to cut open a spot in their hull for Marines to go on board. You can also see the thrusters for the VTOL here, and a few other places. This one still does have the cannon in the front, and the radius and sensor gear. But yeah, it's otherwise pretty bare bones. So yeah, it's very much the workhorse of the colonial fleet. Not pretty, not terribly fast, not a fighter at all. When it's set up like this is for more either ground assault or assaulting large capital ships. You would definitely need escort. Raptors can also use their sensors to paint targets with lasers or what have you for other warships to vector in on and increase their effective range. It's one of those ships that if probably something better had been available to the colonies, they would have been retired, but they worked. It's, like I said, the A-10 is kind of in the same position today. Although, since it can carry troops as well, it does have something in common with, say, the MiL Mi 24 hind. Here we go. And it is analogous to another recent addition to our fleet from the Cylon side, the Heavy Raider. So let's compare those real quick. Not to spend too much time on the Heavy Raider, aka the Turkey, because I've covered this in a couple of videos, but it is worth comparing because whereas the Raptor was primarily designed as a transport electronic warfare craft, and it was kind of pressed into the secondary role of assault aircraft, spacecraft, what have you. This was primarily designed as an attack, assault, boarding aircraft, spacecraft. It can carry up to 10 Centurions, which are quite a bit bigger. It has 2 triple barrel autocannon in the front. I believe they're just 20mm, but again, they're triple barrel. It has 2 short-range missile launchers in the front, kind of automatic missile launchers. And then it has internal bays for dropping bombs, nukes, or long-range missiles. And I don't know how big the Heavy Raider is. I haven't come across a reliable size, but it's relatively narrow, but also relatively long. This is a pretty big spacecraft. And again, it's primarily designed for fighting assault. Whereas our good old Turkey here, against the Turkey here, is we're pressed into it. The Raptor is not a huge spacecraft / aircraft. In atmosphere, it typically has a cruising speed of around Mach 2.5, but it can easily reach escape velocities. It has a maximum acceleration of about 6 Gs, but typically they keep this lower to about 1 G to conserve on fuel. Again, when it's in more of the assault role like this, it has a minimal crew, usually just the 2, maybe a third person in the back for the weapons to help reload if needed, what have you. For the crew of 2, it has enough consumables on board standard to supply them for up to 30 days. So these are set up for pretty long range, long duration missions. Although I'm sure most would not want to be trapped in a ship of this size for that long. In the real world, not only do they have a CGI model, they had a essentially 1-to-1 model for shooting, even one that people could be inside and they could hoist up on a crane and dangle in the air several dozen, even up to 100 feet. So a lot of practical effects were used in the Raptor, as well as CGI, just, when and where necessary. And it was pretty critical in the whole franchise, from the miniseries all the way through the 4th season, where some of these Raptors were fitted with the FTL drive and navigational gear from a Heavy Raider to vastly increase their range for jumps. And because it was such a multi-role craft, it just, was useful. It was kind of a shuttle with teeth, if you will. In the original series, we had just shuttles and we had Vipers. This is something in between. Most Vipers were space superiority, like the Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 7. They did try doing more of a multi-role thing with the ground attack and space attack with the Mark 3, but since we don't see many Mark 3s, it doesn't seem to have been all that successful. One thing to note, these were not launched from the same tubes on Battlestars as Vipers. Instead, they had to leave the flight deck standard. A large ship like Pegasus would usually carry around 50 Raptors. A smaller one like Galactica would carry between about 8 and maybe 20 maximum. And a small Battlestar like the Valkyrie type would carry probably anywhere from 4 to 6. One thing to note, quite a few Raptors survived the fall of the colonies because they did have FTL capabilities. We saw in the miniseries a lot of ships had to be left behind because either their FTL drives were not functioning properly or they simply did not have FTL drives. The ones that could escape would try to meet up with the battle group at the Ragnarok Anchorage. I don't know why, but I find that whole scene very interesting. It's very cinematic and interesting. Maybe it's because it's just not something you see in something like Star Trek or even Star Wars much. Anyway, so that's why I think there's a lot of Raptors in the series, at least in universe. They seem like they have a decent number of Raptors, and it makes sense. While the Pegasus could manufacture new Vipers, we don't see any evidence it could manufacture new Raptors, but that's not to say it could not as well. Anyway, when they met up with the Pegasus, it brought several Raptors to the fight as well. I don't know. Neat model. Definitely from the beginning of this collection, it's one I was hoping they would do. However, I really wasn't hoping or even wanting to. So when they first announced the Heavy Raptor, and a few of you helped explain to me what it was, gotta be honest, a little disappointed. But after getting the model, let's close out this video with my thoughts on it and on Boomers, and if I regret having both, and if I were to only pick one, which would I get? Here they are again, side by side. Not something I can address, but to you, is there a paint difference? And if so, which do you prefer? Eaglemoss is very good about not reusing molds, especially when not required. They've done quite a few Miranda-class variants for the Star Trek series, and often they will actually make a slightly new mold for each one. And they did Scar, which could have just been a repaint, slightly retool of the standard Raider, but they didn't. They actually did make a new mold for Scar, even if they made a mistake with it. Engines. So with this, it really does seem like they more or less used the same mold because it's the same ship. It just has different accoutrements on it. But I will say, with that accepted, they really didn't half-ass it. They really armed her up. Every hard point has something. And they didn't just put the same missile over and over. They kind of gave it a full combat loadout, but they gave different things to show you kind of different accoutrement it can have. I really like these auto cannons on the side, little piping here, the supply for power and ammunition drum there, the quad missile rack, and of course the little rocket pod. All of this stuff is very similar to what you would see on a modern day attack assault helicopter, really is. And the stand is the same, and these sit in very decently. It's one thing I like. I like the Battlestar Galactica stands, except for maybe a couple of the earliest ones. They sit on very well. but they don't really clip on or clamp on if they can help it, and they're easy just to pick up and take off, and they're very minimalist. They very much disappear. Now, when I first talked about boomers, I said it's a shame that Eaglemoss doesn't do like Hobby Master, gear up or down, ordnance on or off. If they did, really having two would be pointless. You could just have this as a stripped down variant and have hard points and just connect in weapons. But that's not how Eaglemoss does things. Never have, probably never will. So even though I wasn't super excited about the Heavy Raptor, I think they really did give it their all. And it is nice to have a combat-oriented ship. And even Hobby Master will sometimes do an unarmed and an armed version. For example, they have done it recently with the Japanese Mitsubishi XF2B. They did a stripped down version and an armed version, so that's not uncommon to hear of in the diecast or in modeling world in general. And these really do represent different roles. This is more of a, I think of it as like a liberation of New Caprica or nuking of the Cylons in Season 4. Whereas, again, this is very obviously Boomer's Raptor from Season 1. So they do represent different stages. And to be fair, we've already received Viper Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, Mark 7. And even in the Mark 2, there are a few different kind of special collector's versions, like Huskers or two types of Starbucks. So with that said, I guess it's alright to have two Raptors. Of the two, which do I like? Well, that's easy. The Heavy Raptor, it just has a lot more going on and is just a lot more interesting. But it is busy. It does have a lot sticking out, so there is something to be said for the clean look of the original from Boomer here. It is lighter for obvious reasons because there's just not a lot hanging off of it. And this was issue 10, so halfway through, and this is what are we up, 20 now? I don't think we're at 21 yet. Anyway, so at least they're not back-to-back in the lineup. So if I were starting today in 2020, I'd probably buy the Heavy first, and if I really wanted to, if I was a big Boomer fan, then I might get 10. But having 10 and having had it for quite a long time, I don't regret putting a little more money in, because I really do enjoy this Battlestar collection. It's quite interesting. And it's one unlike with the Star Trek that I got into somewhat late, this one I got into very early on when they only had a couple of issues out. So I've been kind of happy each time they release one. And luckily they don't put them out too often. About one every 1 to 2 months. And they're not cheap, but with discount codes and stuff, they're about $50, which is honestly what you'd pay for a lot of plastic models. I was speaking of, because I know some people ask, using a 1/48 scale model, plastic model, is kind of a representative. This seems to be, if you kind of use the wingspan as a measuring point, about a 1/56 scale model. I don't know if that matters, but I found that a little interesting factoid. So, thought I would share it. Math, it's a wonderful thing. So yeah, if I had just to get one, I would get the Heavy, but I don't regret having both. Why not? And it's always good to get another member of the fleet. And it'll be interesting to see what they do next. It is kind of a bit unusual that even though they have several ships they have not touched yet, like for example the Demetrius or the Thallium refinery ship or the Galactica from Blood and Chrome, that recently they've kind of revisited some. Again, Scar is just a Raider variant, and now 2 Raptors. So, hopefully they will do at least a few more Battlestars. And I know a lot of people have mentioned that they would like to see them do ships from the Deadlock series. And I'm not saying that's a bad idea. I have to wonder if they have the licensing for it, and they very well might. But, with this kind of properties, officially licensed stuff, you have to be careful about stepping on toes. Anyway, since this one was a bit of time in coming, I thought, why not do a nice long video? So which do you like better? What do you think? Or maybe you don't like either one. Maybe you're strictly a Viper fan. The Vipers are cool. But yeah, I do appreciate you tuning in. As always, if you could like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to help support the channel, please check out the link to my Patreon page over at Mishaco. Because over there we talk about real big guns. Alrighty, folks. I'm going to pack it in for the night. I do appreciate it, and I'll catch you very soon next time.